Thank you for watching. My name is Glenn Morgan, and this is We the Governed. We are back to part 2 of our election integrity video series on Washington State. And the topic on this segment is going to be, if I was going to commit election fraud in Washington State, how would I do it and what would that look like? Well, we're back in the studio today with Representative Jim Walsh. Jim, thank you so much for continuing on with this whole series. And this is an interesting topic. I don't know anybody that's ever done anything like this, but I do have to say, for our listeners who are out there, if this video gets censored and it vanishes off the internet because Google doesn't like us talking about elections at all, then I will find a way to link this up on my website at wethegovern.com through another platform. Hopefully they don't do that, but if it happens, that's what we will do. So with that, Representative Walsh, thank you for being in the studio talking about this. It's a weird subject, but we were ended our last segment just talking about some of the problems with election integrity. I know it wasn't comprehensive, but it was talking about the law and some other issues. And one of the things that you and I have talked about is, hey, how would you actually go about committing election fraud in Washington State? Or how would you go and do something that would be able to sway the results of the election different than what the real voters actually wanted? And that's a very challenging subject to talk about. So I'm putting you on the spot, but
sure. Well, Glenn, most people watching news, reading stories about it, think that the great risk of a manipulated election these days involves computer hacking. That somehow a bad actor would get access to a state's computer system and switch votes, and move votes that were for candidate A over to candidate B, and that candidate A might look like that person was winning on election night, and then candidate B miraculously overnight gets a whole bunch more votes, and candidate B ends up winning, and that the bad actor hacks into the computer system, switches the votes, and that gives candidate B the win the next morning. And that's not exactly how it would work,
at least
here
in our
in
state.
Washington.
Right.
And in other states, there was a lot of talk about Michigan in 2020, and there were some curious late night trends there. There was some talk in Georgia of individuals with boxes of ballots hidden under tables that they pulled out, things like
through
this.
multiple times. Sure,
I can't talk to those other states, but here in Washington, if you wanted to cheat, if you wanted to turn an election, what you would do is you would go back to those databases, and these are county databases managed by the 39 counties, and you would look for ballots that had been mailed out to voters that you knew were not going to vote a legitimate ballot. You would look for dead people, people who've moved out of state, and people who are on the lists who do live in the state but aren't legal voters.
Or they're low propensity of voting. I know.
But you would avoid those because a low propensity voter might vote.
Right.
Then there'd be 2 votes in that person's name, and then they would be canceled out, or only one would be accepted. The current system will accept the first ballot.
The first one, yeah. That's
So
the key. Yeah.
What you would want is, the safest would be to use dead people. Because there's no chance a dead person votes. This isn't Cook County, Illinois.
Right.
But what you would do there is you would have a number of ballots that you knew hadn't been cast, and you would vote those ballots, and you would do it by generating a replacement ballot, which can be done legally and can be done fairly easily, and then you would submit those crooked ballots to the county in the name of these dead people or absent people whose names are still on the list of registered voters.
Right.
And if you were really clever, you would, and crooked, you would keep a sort of running tally of names you know are no good, that you could call upon to match up with ballots that you'd voted, and submit them at the county level to be counted. And, this is completely unethical, completely immoral, and completely illegal.
Right.
But it is not mechanically difficult for a bad actor, for someone to do if they have access to the voter information.
And it wouldn't be that. I mean, that's the other thing. The one thing, and I've talked about this, the theoretical models of how do you commit, how is vote fraud potentially, likely to be committed. It doesn't take that many people, to be involved. I know one of the things that we noticed were that you can do is in situations like King County, where you're basically a third of all the ballots are going to one building there. And they get a lot of the ballots long before the election because it's a mail-in ballot, so there's a paper trail and all that paper's piling up. And theoretically, they aren't supposed to count them in advance, right? But there's a lot of things they do in there, and they can have a pretty good sense of where things are going in elections. And if you had a source inside that office and they told you, hey, listen, you're 5 points behind where you should be right now, just so you know. And then that would incentivize them to collect this crufty voter roll collection that they might have and get it all filed in the system. And this is not something that's brand new or a new idea. We saw this back in the 2005 or 2004 Gregoire Rossi race with Acorn afterwards, when they were caught faking all those voter rolls, where they were literally paying people $10 an hour down at the University of Washington library and pulling out the books and just filling out voter registrations. And they at least caught 1,500 people that were fake voter registrations at that time. And that's not a bad way to do it, because you build it right in the system, you collect the signature right off the bat, and then they could match the signature in no control that exists in the system today, whatever spot bad votes coming out of that.
And that required a bunch of people. Yeah, that's one way you could do it.
Yeah, but not that many. I mean, the only reason they even got caught was because they refused to pay the $10 an hour that they had promised. And, it was just they were being too cheap and ripping off their workers. Yeah.
Boy, talk about dumb.
Yeah.
No, but your point is right. You wouldn't even need that many people.
Right, very few people.
But again, we're talking about criminals here.
Right.
This would be a criminal activity.
Bad activity, yeah. Bad,
so
dishonest.
it couldn't be a mistake. This would have to be intentional criminality.
Yeah.
So you would have one person in the election administration office who could have access to the database, could check, and if they were really bad, they would have coded somehow dead people and people who'd moved away. So they could easily sort the list for people they knew weren't going to vote.
Yeah, weren't going to challenge, or unlikely to challenge.
Unlikely to, negligible, almost zero chance of challenging.
Right.
They could generate they could generate replacement ballots, which you can do fairly easily.
Right.
They would generate those ahead of time.
Right.
They would have them filled out in the favor of their preferred candidates.
Right.
And then what they would do is they would link them up to the mailed out ballots that had been sent to the dead people, the people who'd moved away, and the illegal voters.
Right.
And they wouldn't even use the original ballot necessarily. They would use a replacement ballot and submit those in a box at the election headquarters.
Right.
And count those votes.
Right.
And the trick there would be the control is supposed to be, there's supposed to be a signature on the outside of the ballot that the county can match up on the envelope outside the ballot.
Right.
That the county matches up with a archived signature of that individual.
Right.
Well, that's where you would either try to replicate the signature in some way, digital or by hand, or you just have a crooked person in that office not checking, not comparing the signatures. So this would require criminality. I'm not saying it would happen in an honest mistake, but there's a large space where a determined criminal operating, it would have to be an inside job.
Or a couple of people. I mean,
but one or two people could do it.
Could make a huge
difference. One or two people because most responsibility of checking ballots is done in sets of two people.
That's
the idea that discourages
until COVID came by, and then they only had one person. But yeah.
Usually.
Most. Yeah.
So you might need two.
Yeah.
If you had someone in the post office, that would be helpful, because that individual could sit on the ballots that were sent to dead people and people who've moved away. They would come back as return to sender, or they wouldn't be accepted.
Right, and to point people out on that, to emphasize, that was one thing we discovered is it's all automated at the post office anyway. So the Seattle Distribution Center, which handles about a third of all ballots in Washington State, the machine's automatically sorted. It all goes into a bin. Nobody touches this. It just goes through, it picks up the addresses, and it feeds them into a bin that goes off and piles up. And it's filled with ballots, legitimate ballots. They're all piled there. And there's really no evidence of what happens with those ballots afterwards. That's always been a concern.
That's called the chain of custody.
Right.
The chain of custody is broken. There is no reliable chain of custody on ballots in this state.
And 40, 50,000 ballots sitting in that bin can make a big impact in a lot of elections.
That's correct. And so by breaking the chain of custody, that allows for the replacement ballots to be used by a bad actor. Again, this is all criminal. The replacement ballots to be used for that broken chain of custody where those 40,000 might just get put in a big box somewhere and hidden away.
Right.
And then if the crooked person at the post office communicated with the crooked person at the county, at the elections office, they would say, well, this batch, we burned them all.
Right.
So they didn't get to people, so use that batch as the names. So it's an inside job. And it's a serious crime, but the mechanics of it aren't that difficult because of the broken chain of custody on the ballots.
Right.
All it requires is maybe 3 criminals, determined criminals.
And you can spread it out over time because with the mail-in
there's about
voting,
a 3-week period.
Right, you got a 3-week window of time. You might be seriously working hard, but that 3-week window, you can do quite a bit. And I think that's, as simple as that is, and because it is very simple to do that, provided you have some access to basic information, some level of sophistication, small groups, so there's not too many people, loose lip sync ship, so keep it quiet, and you're able to then change the outcome of some of these elections pretty easily in this theoretical model that I'd like to see people disprove that happens, because we are definitely finding in the field enough situations that are raising a lot of questions now when we doorbell the questionable addresses. Not all of them, some of them are perfectly legitimate, but a bunch of them are starting to appear as what the heck happened? Somehow they voted, but no one's ever heard of that name before, this address. Those types of situations, and I think that's really worth looking at.
Yeah, and one of the things over that 3-week period that the criminal might do is not do them all at once.
Right.
You've got a batch of, say, 20,000 votes that you're manipulating and you're really committing fraud on. You could do a few at a time.
Right.
And you could wait and see, even on election night, where your candidate was.
Right.
And bring in more. Now, this is where...
an insider. You still have to have an insider.
You have to be an insider.
Right.
But you could claim they were postmarked properly, or if you had an insider over at the post office determined to commit a crime, they could postmark them so that they were postmarked on election
Or you could
day.
just say they came from a Dropbox somewhere.
That's right. Or if you were inside and a determined criminal, you could claim, well, they were picked up from a Dropbox at 7:59 on...
Which in our state goes on for weeks. I mean, it's amazing to see the volume of those ballots kind of trickle in.
They have to be postmarked, or they have to be picked up by the end of election day at a Dropbox.
Right.
But again, and I emphasize, this wouldn't happen by accident.
Right.
This would require a criminal inside the county's election system.
Right.
But if that criminal were there, the mechanics of doing it aren't that difficult, because there are so many dead people, people who've moved away, and improper people on the voter rolls. If you shrink the number of bad names on the voter database, the job becomes exponentially harder
and more complex
for the criminal.
Yeah.
So right now we have this too large subset of voters on the voter databases who shouldn't be there. And that makes the criminal, that's like a tempting target.
Right.
That makes it easier. The mechanics become easier for the determined criminal. Shrink that down to where it's only a few hundred, and it becomes less likely to tip an election, and it becomes much more difficult mechanically for the bad actor to do.
Right.
So the critical reform, in my opinion, is not to worry so much about the machines being hacked. Remember, if the criminal does what we're talking about, there's a complete paper trail.
Right, total paper trail.
That backs up the result.
That's right.
And you're very likely, if you're recounting and calibrating the machine, it's very likely to count the same result because the count isn't the problem.
Right, and that was
the crooked votes that are the problem.
That was the one weakness I always felt with if you were going to commit vote fraud and you were going to manipulate all the machines, because there's a piece of paper signed to every vote in theory,
right?
Assuming all's done correctly. We know it isn't always, but then your ability, if you do have the ability to recount, you're going to catch it on a recount.
Correct.
If that's what's being done. And I believe that we've done so many recounts over time, not enough. I think that there's more that we've needed to do, and I think hand recounting is better than machine recounting in many cases, but it would just be too easy to catch. Even a statistical sampling of precinct counts would catch basic fraud, machine fraud.
If it were machine fraud.
If it was machine fraud. But
if you're doing the cheat with
right.
the bad ballots,
it'll pass every test.
Right. And my concern is when we talk about the audit, if all we're talking about is a machine recount and a machine calibration,
right.
It doesn't check the cheat, if there is a cheat, then the cheaters say, well, look, we ran the audit,
right.
And everything came up roses. Everything
right.
came up just right.
Right.
And they never look back here at the number of crufty, improper names that are on the voter roll.
Right.
That was the source of the fraud.
And every bad ballot that comes in cancels somebody's legitimate ballot, essentially. I mean, that's the thing I often...
Well, that's the constitutional argument, right?
Right. But I mean, that's one thing I always argue with people. They try to say, well, don't you want everybody to vote? I said, yeah, but I want them to actually be real people. I want them to really be their vote. I don't want it to be somebody else's vote. And I don't want somebody else to vote 10 times, even in King County.
Right.
And so, I think that those are the issues that I think from a public policy standpoint, and as we're looking at trying to fix some of these issues and restore some level of confidence, legitimate confidence, not fake confidence, not like just don't look here, hear no evil, see no evil, find no evil. But no, you want to be critically looking at this and trying to fix it. And this way of cheating is the way that I think that nobody's really done an effective way of trying to head that off.
That's right. The broken chain of custody, the fact that a trusted person isn't in control of the ballot at every stage is the opening to the criminality.
Right.
And in states where you have to go to the ballot place, to the poll to vote,
right.
there's a sort of automatic updating and cleaning of the voter rolls
right.
because you have to show up to vote.
Right.
And you sign the book usually, or there's some sort of sign-in process that is that's a very effective cleaning agent.
It can be.
It updates. But in a state like ours, like Washington, where there are no voting places, everything is done by mail, there isn't that regular update and cleaning with individuals showing up to vote.
Right.
So the responsibility lies even more heavily on the county elections administrators to clean their databases up as
right.
the law requires on an ongoing basis with periodic reviews by, in theory, some other entity.
Right.
The state Secretary of State currently is the one responsible for that. But as we've discussed earlier, the audit, the review, the check could be another agency. It could be the state auditor's agency. It could be the Attorney General, although I don't like that proposition here.
Right.
But under the current law in Washington, the entity ultimately responsible for the quality of the voter data is the state Secretary of State. And so I guess you would say all these possible cheating mechanisms are there. The buck ultimately stops with the state Secretary of State because by statute in this state, that individual in that office is ultimately responsible for the quality of the data in the databases. And
so I guess, this kind of citizen volunteer audit that we're doing, door to door in the state, and it's sort of coming together, and we're getting a lot of this information out there. I mean, we're definitely finding the issues that should have been caught and they aren't, and so we're trying to hopefully motivate that level of cleanup. But to hammer everything's a nail to a legislator, everything's usually going to be a law. From a solution standpoint, we know there's problems that we discussed in the last segment about them not following the existing law that's there with no penalties. So how would you approach this from a legislative standpoint, or is there necessarily an approach legislatively to fix this?
The law as it stands is pretty good, a little vague. I think we don't need a lot of new law on election integrity issues in Washington. We need to add some enforcement mechanism, some teeth to the existing law, so that if the county auditors and if the Secretary of State aren't doing what they're supposed to do to keep their voter databases up to date and clean of dead people, people who've moved away, and people who are here legally but not legal to vote, or people who are here but not legal to vote. Those three categories, if they're not doing that, there should be some price to pay. That doesn't have to be a jail stint. It probably shouldn't be, but there should be some penalty. And the auditor's office, the county should pay somehow, be fined, be penalized, so that there's an incentive at the county level to say, hey, auditor, how often are you cleaning up our voter database?
Right.
And get a report from the auditor once a month or something.
And I guess if I was to look at some potential legislative reform areas that we could look at too, would be revisiting this motor voter rule in the Department.
Oh, that's a terrible one.
Yeah.
And it's being implemented very poorly. That's
Right.
a major problem.
Yeah, so that, and also then audits, the idea of what an audit looks like, what a forensic audit really is, really putting some measuring that and putting that together, and also recognition, as you pointed out, coming to the polls. I mention this example sometimes, but in Northern Ireland, right, there have been a lot of concerns about fraud for many years. And when they instituted stricter ID controls, and they had poll voting, so it wasn't mail-in voting,
Right.
but when they instituted that, the voter rolls dropped by 11%, immediately. And it was largely believed by many observers at the time that that was their fake voters.
The
there.
slush fund.
Yeah,
Right.
and they had interviewed people years later who said that they literally would dress up in costumes and drive around different polls and fake vote, quite often there. So this isn't
With a mail-in, you don't have to do that.
you don't have to
dress
do
up
that.
and
Yeah,
drive
you
around.
could just wear your pajamas and fill it out at home. So, but nevertheless, addressing the fact that these rolls, finding ways to clean them up in a more effective and honest and transparent way is clearly there. And I guess the other thing that I would add is some of the concerns that have been raised is the election observer process has not been tied very well. Some county auditors have been allowed to push election observers, halfway across the room where they're basically ineffective, or so that process is nothing but window dressing. It's not really there as a real observer, but maybe putting some more teeth back into that statute.
Make it clear. Yeah, I mean, election observers are important for more than just finding wrongdoing. We talk about trust
Right.
and confidence that the system is fair.
Right.
Those election observers are there as the representative of the average person.
Right.
And it's important they have access and the ability literally to look at every stage of the
Right.
vote counts to assure that confidence. And it all gets back to that confidence. We have to, integrity is important in the system so that voters believe their vote will count.
Right.
And what we are really flirting with trouble right now in Washington on is voters are beginning to question whether their vote counts.
Right.
And that is a failure of the system.
Right.
So we need to be better about our check mechanisms. We have them. For dead people, it's the federal Social Security Administration's dead list. For people who've moved away, it's the U.S. Postal Service NCOA, National Change of Address Database. And for people who are here but shouldn't be on the voting rolls, we need to reform that motor voter policy we have in place now in Washington. And we need to clean up the Department of Licensing, which is licensing too sloppily
Right.
people who shouldn't be licensed to. They should be licensed to drive, but not registered to vote. And so we've got three risks there. We've got mechanisms for cleaning up the three risks. We've got a state law that is pretty good, but has some blanks in it, some blank spaces. We don't need to redo the law completely. We need to fill in the blank spaces with more clear direction, and we need to put an enforcement mechanism in. We do those things. They're I would say, more scalpel than sledgehammers. We make those scalpel changes, and I think we would get back on the track to having trustworthy elections.
And there may be more than that to fix, of course, but at least that gets us in a direction that isn't a deny, see no evil, hear no evil, pretend there's nothing going on, kind of a situation.
It doesn't fool anybody, Glenn.
Right.
It doesn't fool anybody.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming on and talking about this topic. Again, this is there's a lot of hype, a lot of issues. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I've cared about it for 10 years, and it's exciting that suddenly a lot more people care about it now. It's a good government policy, good reform opportunity for us to clean up a lot of issues in our state and restore some level of confidence anyway. It can be fixed, and we need to just make it a high priority, I think, right now. So
transparency and trust, that's what we need in our elections.
You're in government, so you're going to be on the front lines of doing this, and we really appreciate in the legislature taking point on this and being willing to come out and talk about a topic like that. And I look forward to discussing subjects like this with you in the future, maybe. I'll see what next controversial issue I can find and bring you in on. But with that, I just want to thank our listeners for tuning in, and hopefully we don't give you any ideas on how to go out and commit your own election fraud. That is not our point here. That's not what we want to have happen. But hopefully this makes you think and consider other things that we might have missed. Please feel free to add that in the comments below if you think I've missed something significant or dramatic. If you want to learn more, go to wethegovern.com. And remember, the future does belong to those who show up, in particular those who show up to vote. Thank you.